Rome had conquered the known world by standing still. Its legions advanced like iron walls, shields locked, standards raised, men drilled to fight shoulder to shoulder until the enemy broke in front of them. For centuries, this method had crushed kingdoms, shattered tribes, and humbled empires. Wherever Rome marched, resistance eventually collapsed beneath discipline, steel, and absolute confidence. Rome did not believe it could be defeated. In the year 53 BC, that belief marched east into the desert. What the legions did not know, what they could not yet imagine, was that they were walking into a battlefield where their greatest strengths would become their greatest weaknesses. There would be no enemy line to smash, no center to break, no moment of glorious clash. Instead, Rome would face an enemy it could not reach, could not pin down, and could not force into battle, an enemy that would kill them from a distance. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers would lie dead or captured. Their commander would be gone, their sacred standards would be paraded before a foreign court, and Rome the invincible, would be forced to confront a terrifying truth: there were ways of war it did not understand. This was the moment Rome learned fear in the East. The Romans did not come as conquerors by accident. They came because ambition demanded it. At the center of this disaster stood Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, a member of the ruling triumvirate, and a man haunted by inadequacy. Crassus had gold beyond imagination, political power beyond most men, yet lacked the one thing Rome valued above all else: military glory. Pompey had conquered the East. Caesar was conquering Gaul. Crassus needed a war of his own. Beyond Rome's eastern frontier lay the Parthian Empire, a realm Rome knew surprisingly little about. To Roman senators, Parthia seemed disorganized, distant, and inferior. It had no legions, no fortified marching camps, no Roman-style discipline. Its power rested on cavalry, nomadic traditions, and aristocratic warriors. To Crassus, it looked like an easy victory. The Senate never authorized the war. There was no great provocation, no existential threat. This was a war born of arrogance and hunger for prestige. Crassus marched anyway, leading 7 legions across the Euphrates, convinced that Rome's reputation alone would terrify the Parthians into submission. He was wrong. Parthia was not Rome. The Parthian Empire did not rely on infantry formations or sieges to win wars. Its strength lay in movement, speed, distance. Its warriors grew up in the saddle, mastering the bow before they mastered speech. Their armies did not seek decisive collisions. They sought exhaustion, confusion, and despair. At their core were horse archers, light cavalry armed with powerful composite bows capable of piercing armor at range. Alongside them rode cataphracts, elite shock cavalry encased in metal from head to toe, riders and horses alike transformed into living weapons. And commanding them was a man Rome fatally underestimated: Shurna. Shurna did not plan to defeat Rome in a glorious clash. He planned to unmake it slowly. As the Roman army pushed deeper into Mesopotamia, the land itself began to turn against them. Open plains replaced broken terrain. Water became scarce. Heat crushed morale. The legions marched in tight formations designed for forests and hills, not endless flatlands where enemies could appear and vanish at will. There were no great Parthian armies blocking their path, no fortified cities resisting them, only silence. Then, without warning, the silence broke. Dust appeared on the horizon. Drums echoed across the plain, and suddenly Rome realized it was not hunting an enemy. It was being surrounded by one. The Parthians did not charge, they did not shout, they did not close in. They began to shoot. Arrows fell like rain. From every direction, horse archers rode in wide circles, loosing arrow after arrow into the Roman lines. When the legions tried to advance, the Parthians retreated. When the Romans halted, the arrows continued. Shields rose, formations tightened, discipline held. But the enemy never stopped moving. Hour after hour, the arrows kept coming. Rome had never fought a war like this, and it was only the beginning. The Roman army halted on the open plain near Carrhae, its commanders finally realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. This was not the battlefield they had expected. There were no hills to anchor their flanks, no forests to conceal their movements, no cities to take refuge in. Only endless flat land, stretching outward in every direction, exposed beneath a merciless sky. The legions formed up instinctively, shields overlapping, standards rising, officers shouting orders that had worked 100 times before. But this time discipline did not bring control. It brought immobility. From the dust emerged the Parthian army, not in a solid line, not advancing in ranks, but flowing across the plain like smoke. Horse archers fanned out wide, circling the Roman formation beyond spear range, beyond sword reach, beyond retaliation. Then the arrows came again. They struck shields, arms, faces, and uncovered legs. They punched through armor the Romans believed impenetrable. Men fell screaming, dragged back into formation as comrades tried to hold the line. Centurions barked commands, forcing the ranks to tighten, shields locking into a defensive shell. The Romans did exactly what they had been trained to do. And that was the problem. The tighter the formation became, the more helpless it grew. The Parthians rode freely, loosing arrows with practiced ease. They did not waste shots. They aimed. They waited for gaps, for tired arms, for broken shields. Every Roman attempt to charge was answered by effortless retreat. The enemy did not flee in panic. They withdrew in perfect order, turning in the saddle to fire even as they rode away. The Romans had no answer. As the hours passed, something terrifying became clear. The Parthians were not running out of arrows. Each time the Romans hoped the barrage would weaken, fresh volleys followed. What they could not see, what they could not understand, was that behind the Parthian lines moved camel caravans stacked high with ammunition. The horse archers resupplied without breaking the rhythm of battle. The killing never had to stop. Under the pounding sun, Roman shields grew heavy. Arms trembled. Thirst burned throats raw. Wounded men cried out, unable to be evacuated, trapped inside a formation that could not break without collapsing entirely. This was not a battle of courage. It was a battle of endurance, and Rome was losing. Crassus watched the disaster unfold, powerless to reverse it. Every instinct told him to hold position, to maintain order, to wait for the enemy to tire, to trust in Roman discipline. That instinct had won wars across the Mediterranean. But here, against an enemy that refused to close, waiting only made things worse. The Parthians understood this. They wanted the Romans to stay exactly where they were. When Roman cavalry attempted to engage, they were isolated and overwhelmed. When light infantry advanced, they were cut down before ever reaching their targets. The battlefield stretched wide, and the Parthians controlled every inch of it. Then came the moment that broke the Roman army's spirit. Crassus' son, Publius, young, ambitious, and desperate to restore honor, begged permission to attack. He believed that aggression, Roman aggression, could still shatter the enemy. Crassus hesitated, then agreed. It was the decision Shurna had been waiting for. Publius led his force forward, cavalry, archers, and infantry surging toward what appeared to be a retreating Parthian wing. The enemy gave ground exactly as expected, drawing the Romans farther and farther away from the main army. Then the Parthians turned. Horse archers closed in from all sides. Cataphracts thundered forward, armored lances crashing into Roman lines already under missile fire. Surrounded, cut off, and outnumbered, Publius' force was annihilated. There was no rescue. There was no escape. When the fighting ended, Publius was dead, his head severed and mounted on a spear. The Parthians carried it back toward the Roman lines. As the sun dipped low, Roman soldiers saw something approaching through the dust. At first, they thought it was another charge, then they recognized the face. Crassus recognized his son. The psychological blow was devastating. The legions had endured pain, thirst, and terror, but now despair crept in. If Rome could not protect its own commander's blood, what hope did any of them have? The Parthians did not need to break the formation now. They had broken the will behind it. Night fell, finally ending the barrage, but the silence was worse than the arrows. The Romans withdrew under cover of darkness, abandoning wounded men who begged not to be left behind. Discipline collapsed into chaos as units lost contact with one another, retreating blindly through unfamiliar terrain. Carrhae had not ended. It had only paused, and the worst was yet to come. Night did not bring relief to the Roman army. It brought confusion. As darkness spread across the plain of Carrhae, the legions began to move, not as a single force, not with confidence or order, but in fragments. Officers shouted contradictory commands. Units lost their bearings. Men stumbled over the wounded, over discarded shields, over bodies already growing cold in the desert air. For the first time in generations, a Roman army was retreating not because it had been decisively beaten in close combat, but because it no longer understood how to survive the battlefield. The Parthians did not pursue immediately. They did not need to. They knew where the Romans were going. Crassus ordered a withdrawal toward the city of Carrhae, hoping its walls might offer shelter until morning, but the march quickly turned into a nightmare. Roman formations that relied on daylight and visual contact dissolved in the dark. Scouts vanished, signals failed, cohorts drifted apart, each one convinced the others were nearby until they realized they were alone. Some units marched for hours in the wrong direction, others circled endlessly, trapped by fear and disorientation. The wounded slowed everything, men begged to be carried, others were abandoned when the pace became unbearable. Roman discipline, so powerful in daylight, became fragile in darkness. And fear crept in, fear that the Parthians were watching, fear that arrows would fall again at dawn, fear that Rome itself had led them here to die. By morning the army was no longer whole. It was broken into desperate fragments, each one struggling simply to stay alive. At dawn, the Parthians returned. They emerged from the haze with calm precision, horse archers already spreading wide, cataphracts holding back like silent executioners. They had rested. They had reorganized. They had lost almost nothing the day before. The Romans, by contrast, were exhausted beyond endurance. Crassus gathered what remained of his officers. Their faces told the story before any words were spoken. They had lost control of the army. Supplies were gone. Morale was shattered. Another day of arrow fire would finish them completely. There was only one option left: negotiation. For a Roman commander, this was unthinkable, yet unavoidable. Crassus sent word to the Parthian general, seeking talks. To his surprise, the Parthians agreed. Messengers returned with assurances of safety. The Parthians, they claimed, wanted peace, not annihilation. They offered terms. Rome would withdraw west of the Euphrates. The fighting would end. It sounded reasonable. It sounded merciful. It was neither. The meeting place was chosen deliberately, open ground, far from Roman fortifications, surrounded by Parthian cavalry. Crassus hesitated. His officers warned him. The legions murmured uneasily, sensing danger even as they prayed for salvation. But Crassus had lost authority. His soldiers were no longer confident in his leadership. They demanded action. They demanded an end to the suffering. Surrounded by desperate men and trapped by circumstance, Crassus agreed to go. He walked into the meeting not as a conquering general, but as a man clinging to the last illusion of control. What happened next was chaos. Accounts differ. Some say a struggle broke out during negotiations. Others claim a misunderstanding turned violent. What is certain is this: Crassus was killed. Whether murdered outright or slain in confusion mattered little. Rome's commander was gone, and with him died any remaining hope of recovery. When news of Crassus' death spread through the Roman ranks, the effect was catastrophic. Command structures collapsed instantly. Officers argued over authority. Soldiers panicked. Some tried to surrender. Others fled blindly into the desert. Entire cohorts disintegrated as men abandoned standards they had once sworn to die for. The Parthians did not rush. They closed in slowly. Horse archers harried the fleeing Romans, cutting down stragglers, driving terrified groups toward waiting cataphracts. There was no honor left in the fighting, no glory, no resistance worthy of the name. This was slaughter. By the end, nearly 20,000 Romans lay dead. Another 10,000 were captured and marched east into captivity, never to return. Entire legions ceased to exist. Their eagle standards, sacred symbols of Roman power, were taken as trophies and displayed in Parthian temples. It was one of the worst defeats in Roman history, and Rome could do nothing about it. The shockwaves traveled far beyond the battlefield. In Rome, disbelief turned into rage. Senators cursed Crassus' ambition. Propagandists scrambled to soften the humiliation. But the truth could not be hidden. An Eastern power had destroyed a Roman army in open battle, and had done so without ever allowing Rome to fight on its own terms. For generations, Carrhae became a wound that never healed. Roman commanders remembered it whenever they marched east. Soldiers whispered about it when facing cavalry. Even emperors would later attempt and fail to avenge the defeat, because Carrhae was not just a lost battle, it was a revelation. Rome had built its empire on certainty. Certainty that discipline conquered chaos. Certainty that heavy infantry defeated all enemies. Certainty that Rome's way of war was the final evolution of violence. The Parthians shattered that certainty. They proved that mobility could defeat mass, that distance could defeat courage, that an army could be destroyed without ever being decisively engaged. Carrhae forced Rome to confront a terrifying realization: its dominance was conditional, and in the wide, open lands of the East, those conditions no longer applied. Yet the Parthians, for all their triumph, did not destroy Rome. They did not invade Italy. They did not march west. They did not attempt conquest. They understood something Rome did not. Victory was not about annihilation. It was about limits. Carrhae marked the eastern boundary of Roman ambition for decades. Rome would fight Parthia again many times, but always with caution, always with respect, always with the memory of that day burning in its collective mind. A day when Rome stood still and died where it stood. Carrhae did not end when the killing stopped. Battles rarely do. Some defeats fade with time, absorbed into the long memory of empire. Others linger, reshaping decisions, altering fears, rewriting doctrine. Carrhae was not merely a catastrophe of men and metal. It was a psychological fracture that ran through Roman power for generations. Rome had been wounded in a place it believed untouchable: its confidence. In the immediate aftermath, silence followed panic. Survivors straggled west in broken groups, carrying stories that sounded unbelievable even to Roman ears. An army destroyed without being engaged. Legions paralyzed by arrows. A commander dead in negotiations. Sacred standards lost, not captured in heroic last stands, but taken from exhausted, helpless men. In Rome, the Senate reacted as it always did to disaster: denial first, blame second. Crassus became the convenient scapegoat: his ambition, his greed, his recklessness. By casting the defeat as the failure of one man, Rome could avoid confronting a far more dangerous truth: that the Roman system of war itself had failed, but soldiers remembered. Veterans whispered Carrhae's name like a curse. Eastern auxiliaries spoke of Parthian riders with quiet dread. Commanders who had never seen the battle still planned campaigns around it, because Carrhae revealed something Rome could not unsee. Rome was not universally dominant. For decades, Roman expansion had followed a simple logic: advance, engage, destroy. Infantry-heavy armies marched, fought, built roads, founded cities, and imposed order. It was a system refined over centuries, perfected through relentless repetition. Carrhae broke that system. Against Parthia, Rome's advantages dissolved. Heavy armor became a burden. Close formations became traps. Aggression became predictability. The Romans had trained to fight enemies who either charged or stood their ground. The Parthians did neither. They refused Rome the dignity of decisive combat. This was humiliating beyond measure. Politically, the defeat destabilized the already fragile Roman Republic. Crassus' death removed a crucial balance within the first triumvirate. Without him, rivalry between Pompey and Caesar intensified, accelerating Rome's descent into civil war. In this sense, Carrhae did not merely destroy an army, it hastened the collapse of the Republic itself. Rome's enemies noticed. All across the eastern frontier, subject kingdoms reassessed their loyalties. Some delayed tribute, others hesitated to support Roman campaigns. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and cracks invite pressure. Parthia, meanwhile, understood the symbolic value of its victory. They did not rush to exploit it militarily. Instead, they displayed Rome's captured standards in temples and courts, a deliberate insult. Every Roman envoy who entered Parthian territory was reminded, silently but unmistakably, of Carrhae. Rome never forgot. Over time, adaptation began slowly, grudgingly. Roman commanders increased the use of cavalry. Eastern auxiliaries became more common. New formations were tested, but Rome's core identity remained infantry-centric, and true transformation came painfully late. Even when Rome returned east, it did so cautiously. Campaigns against Parthia were framed not as conquest, but as punishment or containment. Generals promised vengeance but feared repetition. Every march into open terrain revived memories of arrows falling without answer. Carrhae had become doctrine by trauma. Perhaps the most telling evidence of Carrhae's impact came decades later, when Rome finally recovered its lost standards, not through victory but diplomacy. Under Augustus, Rome negotiated their return. No battlefield triumph. No crushing revenge, just agreement. To the Roman public, this was presented as a great achievement, but beneath the propaganda lay an uncomfortable truth. Rome had accepted that Parthia could not be defeated easily, if at all. This was unprecedented. Rome did not negotiate as equals unless forced to. Carrhae had forced it. Yet for all its significance, Carrhae was not the end of Roman-Parthian conflict. It was the beginning of a long, grinding rivalry, one defined not by decisive conquest but by stalemate. Both empires learned from one another. Rome improved its cavalry. Parthia refined its tactics. Each tested the other's limits without crossing into total war. This balance endured for centuries, and it all traced back to one day in the desert when Rome learned that discipline alone could not conquer the world. Carrhae also reshaped how Rome understood war itself. Victory was no longer assumed. Terrain mattered, culture mattered, enemy psychology mattered. War was not a universal equation, it was contextual, adaptive, and unforgiving. The Romans would never say it openly, but from Carrhae onward they fought with fear, fear of distance, fear of mobility, fear of enemies who refused to play by Rome's rules. That fear made Rome more cautious and in time more brittle. Empires are not destroyed only by enemies. They are destroyed by lessons learned too late. Carrhae was a lesson Rome survived but never mastered, and while the Parthian Empire itself would eventually fade, replaced by new Eastern powers, its legacy endured. Every Roman defeat against cavalry, every Eastern setback, every campaign halted short of ambition's reach, all echoed Carrhae, because on that battlefield Rome discovered something more devastating than defeat. It discovered limitation. And once an empire learns its limits, it can never again pretend to be infinite. Carrhae did not fade into history as a single tragic episode. It became a reference point. Long after the bodies had been stripped from the field and the desert winds erased the marks of battle, Roman minds returned to that place again and again. Generals invoked it in planning. Senators whispered it in debate. Soldiers carried it with them in silence whenever they marched east. For Rome, Carrhae became more than a defeat. It became a warning. Empires measure themselves by victories, but they are shaped by defeats. Victories confirm beliefs, defeats challenge them. And Carrhae challenged Rome at the deepest possible level, not tactically, not politically, but existentially. Rome believed history moved in one direction, outward. Expansion was not merely policy, it was destiny. To stop expanding was to stagnate. To stagnate was to decline. This belief had driven Rome from a city-state on the Tiber to master of the Mediterranean. Carrhae interrupted that logic. For the first time in centuries, Rome did not advance because it could not. The eastern frontier hardened not through treaties or laws, but through fear earned in blood. In the years that followed, Roman commanders returned east with vengeance on their minds. Some sought glory, others sought erasure of shame, but even the most aggressive among them could not forget the lesson Carrhae had taught. They marched differently. They scouted more carefully. They avoided open plains when possible. And when Parthian cavalry appeared, Roman confidence faltered. No matter how powerful Rome became, it could never fully shake the memory of helplessness. The Parthians, for their part, understood the value of memory better than Rome ever did. They knew Carrhae was not merely a military victory, it was a psychological triumph. They preserved it carefully, deliberately, displaying Roman standards like sacred relics. Not to provoke invasion, but to remind Rome of the cost. Parthian diplomacy was shaped by Carrhae. Negotiations carried an unspoken balance. Rome could threaten, but Parthia could resist. Unlike Rome's western enemies, Parthia was never treated as inferior. This equality, rare and uncomfortable, endured for generations. Yet history is never static. Empires change, adapt, decay. Rome eventually transformed from republic to empire, from citizen armies to professional forces, from expansionist juggernaut to defensive colossus. But Carrhae remained embedded in Roman identity, resurfacing whenever the East resisted control. Even centuries later, when the Parthian Empire gave way to the Sassanids, Roman commanders still fought shadows born at Carrhae. Cavalry-heavy enemies, mobile warfare, battles where distance, not bravery, determined survival. Rome adapted but never fully mastered what Carrhae exposed, because the problem was not tactical, it was philosophical. Rome believed war was about control. The Parthians believed war was about denial. Rome sought decisive outcomes, Parthia sought endurance. Rome wanted to end wars, Parthia wanted to shape them. Carrhae was the collision of those worldviews, and Rome lost not because it lacked courage or discipline, but because its assumptions were wrong. This is why Carrhae still matters, not because of the numbers killed, not because of the commanders lost, not even because of the standards captured. Carrhae matters because it reveals how power fails. Rome did everything right according to its own logic. It marched confidently. It maintained discipline, it trusted tradition, it followed precedent, and all of it was useless. The Parthians won not by overpowering Rome, but by refusing to fight Rome's war. Throughout history, Carrhae has repeated itself in different forms. Empires built on heavy force struggle against mobility. Rigid systems fail against adaptive enemies. Confidence becomes blindness. Again and again, powerful states march into unfamiliar terrain believing superiority alone guarantees victory, and again they discover limits they did not plan for. Carrhae is not unique, it is universal. For Rome, the defeat never found closure. Even the symbolic recovery of the lost standards under Augustus did not erase the memory, it merely reframed it. Rome declared victory in words because it could not achieve it in arms. The wound remained. A reminder that empire does not equal omnipotence. For the Parthians, Carrhae became legacy without overreach. They did not seek to destroy Rome. They did not try to conquer the Mediterranean. They understood something Rome often forgot: survival is victory. Parthia endured because it knew when not to advance. Rome expanded because it could not stop. In the long arc of history, both strategies carried costs. Carrhae also exposes a deeper truth about military history, one often ignored. Wars are not decided solely by technology or numbers or bravery. They are decided by understanding terrain, understanding culture, understanding how the enemy thinks. Rome failed at Carrhae because it fought Parthia as if it were Gaul, Carthage, or Macedonia. It was none of those, and so Carrhae stands as a monument not to Parthian supremacy or Roman failure, but to mismatch. Mismatch between doctrine and reality. Mismatch between confidence and preparation. Mismatch between expectation and truth. These mismatches destroy armies more efficiently than any weapon. When modern historians return to Carrhae, they do not see a simple defeat. They see the moment an empire confronted the edge of its worldview. Rome survived Carrhae. It even thrived afterward, but it was never again innocent. The certainty that once defined Roman warfare was gone forever. On the plains near Carrhae, Rome did not just lose men, it lost inevitability. And once inevitability is gone, empire becomes something far more fragile, something that must adapt, negotiate, and compromise to survive. That is the true legacy of Carrhae, not the arrows, not the dead, not the humiliation, but the realization that no empire, no matter how disciplined, how rich, how confident, can rule every battlefield on its own terms. Rome learned that lesson the hard way, and the world has been learning it ever since.